Hi everyone, thanks a lot for coming along. I'm Glenn, I'm from the Fenner School. I'm very excited to be introducing our speaker today. Before we get to that, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the area where the ANU operates and where I live, the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people. I want to pay my deepest respects to their elders past and present. I also want to extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, particularly as we're doing this from Zoom land. I see a few familiar names in the list there that are definitely not in Canberra, so it's acknowledging that Australia's First Nations people have never ceded sovereignty and that Australia still lacks a treaty. Okay, today we're going to be speaking to Dr. Megan Evans from UNSW Canberra. And Megan's going to talk through us about her work on why ignoring biodiversity loss is an increasingly risky business. Megan's a lecturer and a research fellow with the School of Business over at UNSW in Canberra. She has an amazing amount of expertise with environmental policy in governance, economics, and also in market-based instruments. Megan's coming back to the Fenner School here. She completed her PhD in public policy in Fenner in 2017, and since then has a lot of direct experience for policy making and currently holds a DECRA fellowship, which is examining the growth of private sector investment in biodiversity and natural capital. So can I just please ask, as best we can in Zoom world, that we welcome Megan back to the Fenner School, and I'm sure everyone's as excited as I am to have a listen. So over to you.
Thanks so much, Glenn. And I am sitting on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country today, and I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country and acknowledge and honour their elders past and present. And I also acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal lands. So I'm also in Fenner School virtually. I did plan on driving the 20 minutes down to campus this morning, but to be honest, I needed the extra time to make my presentation. So that could give you an indication of the quality of the talk that you're going to get today, but hopefully I think I might have just managed to pull it off. But I am really excited to talk to everyone, and I did get a bunch of text messages from friends and colleagues who also were too busy to drive 15 or 20 minutes down from Hackett or Watson today as well. So I know that I'm not completely alone, and I hope we can still have a good chat in Zoom land. So today I'm going to be talking about this on your slide, why ignoring biodiversity loss is an increasingly risky business. And full disclosure, as Glenn said, I'm currently a DECRA fellow, so I have I guess, drew the lucky, I don't know, lucky something of winning the DECRA lottery. That happens every year in Australia for early career researchers. And so I do have funding for the next 3 years to look at the growth of private sector involvement in biodiversity, conservation and natural capital. So these are, as you can imagine, with the year that we've had, some preliminary thoughts about the area. Next year, I am hoping to actually do some actual research, like collecting data rather than just thinking about things and sharing my thoughts with wild abandon. So hopefully this will at least give you a bit of a taste of the kinds of things that I'm thinking about and would like to explore further. So as I said, I'll be giving you a bit of a smorgasbord of what I see is going on in this space. I'll give you some relatively half-formed thoughts on the trends and some of the potential risks of seeing biodiversity loss as a business risk, if that makes sense. And then I'll also give a very, very brief overview of some work that I have been progressing this year, which we're only just starting to go out and collect data now, but that's looking at beef carbon sector neutrality in Queensland. Now, I am struggling to, there we go, okay. So this is just standard biodiversity gloom slide, but is kind of a prerequisite to these kinds of things, just to give some context. So this year in May, and you may have missed it given the year we've had, there was the 5th Global Biodiversity Outlook report, which was the final report card on progress made against the 20 global biodiversity targets that were agreed in 2010 by parties under the International Convention on Biological Diversity. So just as a reminder, that this convention was agreed in 1992, and Australia is one of about 100 parties, and Australia has been party to that convention since 1993. Now, as you may expect, that report found that basically none of these targets that aim to prevent or slow species extinctions had been met. And one of the things that it concluded was that essentially business as usual is incompatible with any kind of interpretation at which human societies are living in harmony with nature. So, you know, pretty kind of dire stuff. And this was more or less in agreement with a report that came out last year by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And thankfully, that report did actually, as you can see on the screen here, provide some, rather than, you know, everything is dying, they provided some suggestions and a lot of thinking into, okay, how do we actually do this transformation? What are the leverage points? Who's involved in this system? Who's responsible for which bits? So that's a lot of work that Sandra Diaz and others have done. And there's a lot more, I guess, social science and humanities and creative arts work happening now around the biodiversity space, in recognition that yes, we need science to be able to understand and measure and predict biodiversity trends, but in order to transform society, we need more than that. We need more than rational information. So that's a little bit of a side note, I suppose. But just to give you some context, more context. I just put these slides together this morning, so it's going to be a surprise for everyone every time I click next. That's right. This slide was to kind of remind you that not everything is pointless, in that conservation, I'm going to put my little light on so you can see my face. Oh no, you don't need to see my face better. That's unnecessary. Conservation works, and even though we worry about lack of investment in conservation and lack of conservation action, the information, the bit of information that we do have about conservation, the effectiveness of conservation, is that, well, on a whole, it does work. We just need money and serious commitment. So there was a paper that came out just recently in Conservation Letters that essentially found that, well, up to 25 bird and animal species that probably would have been extinct without conservation are not, because we managed to scrape together enough money to prevent those extinctions. And another one from a couple of years ago in Nature more or less found that accounting for all various other confounding variables, countries that invest in conservation have lower biodiversity loss. So yes, things are hard, and yes, as human pressures increase, where need to start thinking about the compatibility of particular development pathways with nature. So we might need to spend more money to compensate for loss, etc. But generally speaking, if we spend money on protecting nature, it works. Okay, so this was the point where I just wanted to, take a step back and go, okay, that's all the bad news. Can we move on? Because that makes me feel like the robot from Star Wars, whose name I can't quite remember right now. We've been talking a fair bit over a long time about we need to put a price on nature in order for businesses and people to make better decisions and better account for the impacts and benefits of biodiversity and nature in our policy or business or investment decision making. So there's a collection of articles there. So there's the Costanza paper from 2007, 1997, where they found the first global estimate of the value of nature. Then there was one from 2009 where, that was in Nature as well, talking to Gretchen Daly about her work on valuing ecosystem services. Then there was the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, which was a thing from 10, 15 years ago. So there has been, a lot of work and discussion about this idea that we need to price nature so businesses can make better decisions. But there hasn't, I guess, well, obviously we haven't really seen that global transformation that we need to have the changes that we need. Now, that's right. I want to show you this as well. If anyone can actually write in the chat, I don't know if you can actually talk to me, but just want to have to think about, when do you think these papers and reports might have come about? Because these are some nice, so the one on the left, Neil Gunningham and Mike Young, that was, I think, one of the earlier papers that I'm aware of that was thinking about policy mixes for biodiversity conservation and was talking about the mix of regulatory and information and economic. Oh, I see some chat. 1995, 97, Colvin. So that Gunningham and Young paper was from 1997. The one on the right, so that was one of the many efforts that have come out of the Australian government in terms of report, making economic valuation markets work for biodiversity conservation. If Steve Dovers is on the line, which in fairness, he's probably not, he's out kayaking somewhere, I'm sure, he would jump on the Land and Water Australia and say that this would be in the 2000s, and he would be correct, it was from 2005. So just to give you a taste that we have been talking about this stuff for a while. Next slide. But the narrative has shifted a bit, even in, well, I wrote my grant proposal for the fellowship I'm on now in late 2018. And even in the last 12 months to 2 or 3 years, there's been this interesting shift where rather than the actors being primarily governments making policy or introducing market-based schemes, or researchers talking about the need to price nature, we're actually seeing this really interesting shift towards the private sector itself, talking about investment risk, business risk, and investing in nature and natural capital. So, and there's also been a bit of a language shift from ecosystem services and payments for ecosystem services, which are have historically been schemes that governments have devised and introduced to talking about natural capital accounting. Now, I personally can't really see much of a difference between natural capital accounting and value and ecosystem services, but it appears that the natural capital terminology is much more salient for the business and financial sectors. So I think it's basically the same thing, but it's interesting in that there has been that shift in language in terms of who is at the table and talking about these kinds of things. So, on top left, we've got Financial Times, we've got Washington Post, talking about fund managers. We've got the World Economic Forum talking about, and also highlighting one of the risks associated with leveraging private capital to protect nature. We need to think about greenwashing. And then also, so the one on the bottom left is when the firm Pollination, which Martijn Wilder is one of the partners, or the key partner there, partnered with the bank HSBC to essentially raise, I think it was about $3 billion to invest in natural capital projects and things that would help mitigate climate change, which is a decent amount of money. More stuff. So we've got UNDP, UN Development Programme, with the Biodiversity Finance Initiative. The one on the bottom left, I find really interesting in that investment in the Sustainable Development Goals are a $1 trillion opportunity for business. So investing in reducing poverty is a investment opportunity. Now, you may or may not have thoughts about that framing, but for me, it's still interesting in how this is being promoted and framed to the private sector. And on the one on the right is the first, it's the second of these reports that have come out that Credit Suisse and Rockefeller and McKinsey have done, looking at conservation finance in terms of reframing the need to invest in conservation as an asset class, as an investment opportunity. And this report is the third and most recent of that series, which involve McKinsey, and in this case the Nature Conservancy. And they've changed. They used to talk about the conservation finance gap, and now they're calling it the nature funding gap. And maybe that's another reframing to try to be a bit more salient to a broader range of actors. There was some really nice infographics in that report, and it was quite exhaustive. So the overall point from that work was to say, hey, globally, we actually need a whole lot more money to be able to properly protect nature broadly, meaning biodiversity, as well as natural capital, so soil, water, air, etc. And they estimated that current spending globally is, 124 to 143 billion a year. And what is actually needed is what they call the nature funding gap of between 600 and 800 billion a year. And they provide a whole range of different pathways and ways in which they argue that funding could be raised, or that capital could be raised. And it's not just government funding, even though that is still absolutely necessary. And that's one of their core arguments, that, look, these calls to leverage and unlock private capital isn't saying to government, don't worry, we've got it sorted out, private sector is gonna sort it out. what we actually need to be able to close that nature funding gap is a massive increase in government funding, because government investing in something is a sign that this is actually a good investment. So this is far from well, and the unfortunate thing is that maybe some governments might say, excellent, private sector is going to sort it out, which is you know, a trend that we see in other sectors. But the opposite is actually true. We do need governments to step up, and I'll bang on about that a bit more later. Moving a bit sideways into the climate space, and the reason why I say I'm talking about climate now is because there has been a fair bit more work in the climate risk accounting space than biodiversity. So biodiversity is still fairly nascent and emerging, but what is happening is that the climate change risk reporting frameworks like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures are actually being used as a bit of a model for how investors and banks and corporates might actually start thinking about nature-related financial disclosures. And this is a voluntary framework that the industry itself has come together and developed. I think it was backed by Michael Bloomberg, and interestingly, so in Australia, the Australian banking and finance sector has come up with, I think, modelled on the TCFD, their own framework, which the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority had made some noises saying that, look, we're going to have to start accounting for this. But because the sector has moved by itself, APRA haven't had to kind of step in with a big regulatory stick, which is interesting. And the TCFD was also, again, used as a model recently by New Zealand. A few weeks ago, New Zealand essentially adopted the TCFD framework as their framework for mandatory climate risk reporting in New Zealand. So mentioning this because what happens in the climate space, you know, biodiversity might follow a similar pattern. And that's essentially what's happened. So just earlier this year, a bunch of banks and financing people and environmental NGOs came together to do the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, right? Which is cool. They've come up with, well, they're starting to think about a framework. Yay, I don't entirely know what exactly that means yet. So I look forward to learning more. But I guess, yes, it's cool that stuff is happening. I hope these things don't just follow the trend of, excellent, we've got some information and people will use that information rationally. Everything will be taken care of. No, I don't. Yeah, that I guess that's one of my concerns in terms of, cool, it's great that these things are happening, but let's be wary of some of these traps in terms of, you know, people don't necessarily incorporate information rationally into their decision making, and we also need to account for potential greenwash as well as self-regulation by industry. You know, there's a few little red flags that we need to be wary of. But in itself, the fact that you have, you know, the finance sector, the environmental sector, and as I'll mention a bit later, the agricultural sector increasingly coming together and saying, right, we need to try to solve this problem together, largely because governments have collectively not actually done the best job in terms of dealing with biodiversity loss. And, you know, I guess I'm having a bit of a go at government at the moment, just because of the fact that traditionally it has been government or the state who has been responsible for responding to biodiversity loss on our behalf. So I mentioned the International Convention on Biological Diversity. That's a forum, an international forum of governments coming together and saying we're going to do stuff to help the environment because it's in the public good's interest. That's not to say that we as individuals don't have responsibility, but traditionally the public vote for governments to act in their behalf. So that's why I guess traditionally we have expected government to do things to help protect the environment, but to date, as we can see, it hasn't been super effective. And this, I hope, is the last background slide. Some work that some clever people at University College London have started looking at nature-related financial risks, and they're saying actually stuff's much more complex in the biodiversity space than the climate space. And you can expect that one of the reasons that might be the case is because in terms of climate, I mean, it's all complex, right? But in terms of climate change and how that has been marketized, it's around carbon offsets, and that's a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent that we commodify and trade with biodiversity. There's no one unit of analysis that we can marketize as easily because biodiversity is inherently more complex. So one of the recommendations here from this report was we can't just rely on information, risk-based information, to be able to make decisions. So we need to apply the precautionary principle before making decisions, which if anyone is familiar with environmental policy in Australia, you might remember that the Federal Environment Biodiversity Conservation Protection Act, EPBC Act, the precautionary principle is one of the core principles of that legislation. Now, this is not the talk to talk about it, but one might argue that potentially the precautionary principle is not adequately taken into account when making decisions under that legislation. So it's interesting that when we start talking about the finance space, these people have said we need to account for the precautionary principle, and we have to act before we have all the information. So I do hope that there are some lessons learned from all the other years of research where ecologists have said and legal scholars have said precisely the same thing. Okay. Oh, and there's another one. This one, as much as there is, I guess some interesting fanfare and commitments being made by financial institutions and banks, this is a report that came out October, which admittedly I haven't looked into in a huge amount yet. It's actually a little bit mysterious about who's done the report. Portfolio Earth, it's actually quite difficult to figure out who on earth are these people. But they've done a hugely comprehensive analysis that shows that, I guess there are many still in the financial sector who are investing in sectors and activities and portfolios that are harmful to nature. So yes, it's great that movements are being made, but we also need to be wary of greenwash and ensuring that, well, it's great that you've made a commitment to divest in these kinds of activities, or you've got some high-level policy commitments, but how are you operationalizing those policies and commitments? What's actually happening with your investments? Yes, okay, so we've got to the middle bit. So what? So we've got lots of glossy reports. We've got, financial institutions saying, yes, we're going to take this seriously. I'm going to share some thoughts about what what that actually means, and preface it with the I need to think about it more. But here are some, I guess, initial thoughts about what I would like to look into further and be wary of amidst these calls for greater private sector involvement and investment in biodiversity conservation, and how that is actually going to be operationalized beyond the proliferation of lots and lots of glossy PDFs about frameworks and stuff that's being created. A bit of shameless self-promotion. As I mentioned earlier, none of this, you know, private sector investment unlocking stuff means that governments have a get out of jail free card. There is a trend, not just in environment, but of, you know, in other sectors like health and social services, of governments outsourcing and stepping away from involvement in activities and investments in sectors where they have traditionally played a greater role, on the promise and expectation that it'll be more efficient and effective if the market deals with it. I'm not going to go into a massive critique of you know, new public management or neoliberalisation of environmental services in this talk, other than to say that and to repeat that an increase in government funding, is actual spending, investment, whatever you want to call it, is needed to close this nature funding gap. But the role of government might change slightly, or there might be a greater number of roles. So rather than traditionally government being, you know, do this or else kind of regulator role, it may shift to a bit more of a market enabler role, or a coordination, facilitation role. So, and that can be a bit tricky sometimes, in that how do you deal with, and I know there's a scholarly term for it, but I can't remember it right now. How do you deal with the fact that you might have, you know, government is not a monolithic thing. There is a diversity of bits within government. You might have one arm of government that is a compliance and enforcement regulator, and then you might have another arm of government that is, you know, doing a lot of schmoozing and trying to, you know, get private sector involvement in particular initiatives or investments and raise funding, and, you know, have like a kind of more of a happy, relaxed, enabling hugs facilitation relationship with regulated entities in one particular agency within government. And then, you know, a couple of floors down, you might have the regulatory arm who are, you know, butting heads with these industries or companies as a regulator. So there's tensions there that needs to be dealt with. But I guess I highlight the need for facilitation and coordination leadership in particular in this space, because while it's great that the private sector is doing stuff and they're all very excited and they want to do things, the risk is that, one risk I see is that with lots of people doing stuff, there might end up being some confusion and redundancy, which, you know, there's nothing wrong with redundancy in the system in itself. That's the marketplace of ideas, etc. But I think there is still a role for government to lead and to coordinate and reduce those transaction costs for all of those private and community actors out there trying to actually do something. If everyone's doing their own thing, we don't have any kind of standardization or coherence in the marketplace. So there is still a key role for government in enabling and coordinating, which in my view, that hasn't been done effectively yet in Australia. In terms, ooh, went too far. Oh no, sorry. In terms of a Captain Obvious take, but just needing to be obvious, the private sector will act in the private interest. So the private sector will want to invest in something that delivers a financial return, and they can properly account for the risks, and they have an expectation of what they're going to get. They want to invest in an outcome. They don't necessarily want to invest in an input or a process. So, for example, one reason why that might be problematic in some cases is, well, ecological systems are inherently complex, and we never have enough information about what happens when we do something in the environment, because monitoring and evaluation generally doesn't happen as much. And another thing, because a lot of the time small grants and etc. that are provided or won by environment organisations or community organisations, because they are still relatively small, there's not often a requirement or a huge requirement to report on outcomes. They might need to report that, yes, we planted the trees or we built the fence or what have you. But those don't tell you what the actual ecological outcome is. And because private investors want to have some degree of certainty and as well as some legal leverage in terms of that they're more likely to use an outcomes-based contract. So that says you will deliver, X tons of carbon by this year, or this many healthy bandicoots by this year, which on one hand is a good thing in that, oh, we're actually incentivizing and being assured of outcomes. But what happens if something goes wrong? That puts the onus on the landholder or the community organisation to account for that, which again isn't necessarily a bad thing, but this is a big shift, right? This is a big shift for a sector who doesn't necessarily have the capacity or the financial literacy to deal with these quite complex legal contracts. So in those cases, if we're just interested in, environmental outcomes and with a very kind of blunt metric like area of vegetation, that really, you're going to most quickly and most certainly get that outcome by planting monocultures, for example. If you want to incentivize something that is a bit more risky, like reintroduction of bettongs into somewhere they haven't been for 100 years, that's going to be a much more complex legal and financial arrangement. That's going to take quite a long time to come up with that contract. I recall something that I wasn't directly involved with, but in the year that I spent in government, there was a contract being developed, a three-way contract between government and a broker and a landholder to do a carbon farming project that also delivered benefits for koala. It took 18 months to come up with that contract because it's quite novel. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about there. And also obviously things like equity and justice, risk being overlooked. So for example, if investment in this particular community is promoted as an investment opportunity, how is that being measured and reported on by whom? Like who's it an investment opportunity for? How do we ensure that the community itself are happy with that arrangement? I mentioned before that there are, I think, some important lessons to learn from other sectors. So, for example, the experience of the implementation of the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and how that how that has transformed disability services in Australia, and not always for the better, from the perspectives of the people who actually need those services. You know, I know from the experience of a friend on the NDIS that she's hired a bookkeeper to deal with all of her contracts, just to get people to come in and help her, because it takes a lot of time and energy to deal with hiring and firing people who may or may not have entirely the right training, even though there's lots of things to help with that. But it's exhausting, and people are on the NDIS because they don't have the energy or the health to be able to do these kinds of tasks. So I think there's a lot to be learned from there. And again, a little bit left field, well, not left field, but we know that economic framing and marketisation has effects on people's behaviour, in terms of voluntary efforts might be crowded out. There's an example just from up the road where I live in Watson, whereby in the ACT there's not an awful lot of land. So what the ACT government has done over the years is, when they have built new housing developments and then being required to offset or compensate for the loss of those woodlands, they have, to be able to deliver those offsets, though they've used land within existing protected areas as offsets. So that's one could say it's a very creative interpretation of the principles of offsetting in terms of additionality and needing to compensate for a loss. They've just used, I guess, pie they already had sitting on the table to use as compensation, even though they never really planned on eating that pie anyway. In particular with the Watson Woodlands example, you can Google that, and Phil Gibbons, I think, did an interview about this a few years ago, where people who had been working to restore and protect these woodlands for years were, understandably a little bit upset that their voluntary efforts have then overnight been used to or traded to compensate for a housing development. So that's not necessarily a good thing in my view. That's an extra slide that I clearly forgot to delete. Oh, I've numbered. Oh no, I've got the right numbering here. Fourth, we have a lot of work that has been done looking at environmental markets in the literature and in practice and policy. Can we please not forget those experiences and what we've learned already when we're talking about leveraging private sector investment and natural capital accounting? They're different words, but we're largely talking about the same kinds of things in terms of governance risks, social risks. We still don't know what really environmental outcomes are being delivered by biodiversity offset markets globally. So before we jump on another bandwagon, can we just stop and calibrate and listen and have a look at the past? Number 3, that's meant to be number 5. Finally, when we're talking about private investment in conservation as an opportunity, you may or may not have noticed this, but the way it's framed a lot of the time, it's very much about the opportunity for investors. And then it's also an opportunity for landholders or people involved in conservation to make use or to capitalise on these new financial flows. I haven't seen as much discussion about the perspectives of people and organisations working on the ground who would then be essentially expected to completely transform their way of doing things to make use of those additional financial flows. So again, can we think about it from their perspectives? They're not rational economic actors. And it might not just be money that incentivizes or informs their behaviour, and also thinking about what kind of risks and barriers do they face in terms of jumping on that bandwagon as well. Okay, I'm going to recalibrate and have a sip of water. So I do want to briefly just talk about, I've talked about it all from the perspective of the financial sector so far. And then it can be easy when you only look at those kinds of articles in the Financial Times and what have you, well, what does it actually mean on the ground? How are all of those policies and commitments being operationalised by people who currently work on the land or work in the environmental agricultural space? What does that mean for them? So this is an example of, so in agriculture in Australia, I think it's maybe a year or 2 years ago, Meat and Livestock Australia made a commitment to become carbon neutral by 2030. And earlier this year, the National Farmers Federation, so that's a whole hugely diverse collection of agricultural and natural resource management organisations across the country, came together and agreed to an aspirational target of carbon neutrality by 2050. And they're committed to actually figuring out how to make this work, because it's not just about green credentials or trying to capitalise on potential new investment. It's, well, climate change is a material risk to the sector in terms of impacts on crops and water supply. It's in their best interests to figure out how to do this. So that's the MLA example. There's a beef sustainability framework, which I'm aware that Brad Witt talked about in an earlier FENA seminar series. So the sector itself is working to try to figure out what steps are needed to transform themselves to essentially become more on a sustainable path. This was actually only a couple of weeks ago. I saw it come up in my news feed where talking about the beef industry, and this is a former industry leader. I don't know who this person is, but it just kind of exemplifies, I guess it's also a recognition of the social license and the exposure, the reputational exposure of the beef sector in terms of climate impacts. We know that the sector as a whole, does have a significant contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. There are absolutely ways in which beef production is much more compatible with the environment and in terms of biodiversity as well as carbon sequestration. But there's obviously a lot of diversity within producers or between producers within the sector. So how do we actually, I guess, learn from the lessons of those who have gone out, the leaders within the sector who have done some incredible things in terms of transforming their businesses? How can we learn from them? And how can we assist others who maybe don't have the financial or social capital needed to do that transformation? How does that, how can that put the entire sector on the right path? So just so you know, it's not just me complaining about the beef sector, not complaining, but so this is work that Diane Maybury at CSIRO did. This work was commissioned by Meat and Livestock Australia, and they did, Diane and her team did a a national assessment of the beef sector's emissions profile. And the graph on the left essentially shows the 2005 baseline is annual emissions of the whole, this isn't just beef actually, it's red meat, in 2005. Then the 2015 was a bit less. And then what they've done is done some work to kind of estimate under different kind of future scenarios in terms of adoption of different technologies or different vegetation management practices so technologies including like the plankton that the cows eat to make them burp less. What are the likely impacts of all of those different pathways? So vegetation management in terms of clearing less land and maybe not burning the vegetation after it's cleared, that does have a big impact, as well as potentially finishing more stock in feedlots. And then maybe making use of sort of high value beef. That's an example where we might be able to access higher value markets in exchange for better green credentials. So labelling and very well looked after cows that get a lot of marbling and the like. But each of these pathways cost different things, and generally speaking, changing clearing practices might be the most cost effective. But that was a national snapshot for the whole red meat sector. And what we need, what the kind of information that the sector needs to be able to translate that information, it needs to be a bit more fine scale and a bit more nuanced. To be able to, I guess, the circumstances of producers in one part of the country are likely going to be very, very different to producers in another in terms of the type of vegetation that they deal with, the available financial and social capital and the like. So we need a bit more, and I'm going to use the word, I hate it, we need a bit more granularity with our science and policy recommendations to be able to assist this sector. So this is some work, and this is just a picture because I don't have any results to show you yet, but some work that I'm doing with colleagues at CSIRO to actually model what these carbon neutrality or pathways to carbon neutrality could be within Queensland. We're focusing on Queensland because, as you can see from this admittedly slightly out of date map, Queensland has the biggest beef cattle herd in the country by far, absolutely by far. But there's also huge opportunities in Queensland in terms of carbon abatement opportunity or sequestration opportunity, because of the huge landscapes and ecological capacity of vegetation in Queensland. That is actually a bit different to the rest of the country, largely because Queensland was cleared last after colonisation. So we'll be doing some, well, I won't be doing it. Karen and Steve from CSIRO will be doing their full CAN modelling, so we'll be quantifying and predicting carbon sequestration abatement under a few different scenarios. And we just got ethics approval yesterday. One thing that we want to do is actually speak to some producers or just generally people who know about veg management techniques in their producing region. How do you manage your vegetation? What kind of techniques do you use? Do you burn it afterwards? Do you not? Do you leave the leaves and bark and stuff on the ground, or do you dump it somewhere else? Because all of those things will affect the emissions profile of a particular enterprise, and it could be that there might be within one region there's a lot of burning, in another region there isn't. So that kind of information will mean that, oh, well, this region or producers in this region are generally doing actually pretty amazing stuff, but it's this region over here that might need a bit more assistance or something to be able to get a bit more onto the carbon neutral pathway. So that's work in pro, and I hope I can tell you those results when we get them, hopefully soon. And that's the end.
Thanks so much, Megan. The best I can do is a Zoom clap. Just imagine the other 32 attendees are all applauding along, as I'm sure they are. Thanks so much for your amazing and really interesting talk. So we're going to open up now for questions and answers. I can see there's a few have come in here already. If you have a question for Megan, please just click the Q&A button down the bottom and type it in there. I see Sol has typed applause, so yeah, so I might just get stuck straight into those. So I have a question from Nikki Banados. When you're talking about government needing to take a greater role of investing more into biodiversity, are you talking about all levels equally, as in local, state, federal, or more specifically at a single level? And there's a second part to that, which you can probably add on and answer, is how can we pressure the government to do more?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. The simple answer is all levels of government, I think, have a responsibility to invest in the environment. The way things are structured in Australia because of our federation, typically the states have had a greater degree of responsibility over the environment, and the federal government have had responsibility for matters of national environmental significance under the EPBC Act. Now, as you may or may not be aware, the federal government is currently trying very, very hard to step away as much as it can from at least those legislative responsibilities. It is difficult to keep track of investments and budget expenditure at the federal and probably the state level as well. I do know that investment in the Federal Environment Department, and that's just the full running of the department, not just actual spending on conservation, that budget has declined by at least 40% since 2013. So there is a trend of reducing expenditure at the federal level. I don't really know about the state level. So I think all have a responsibility, all have a useful role to play. So, one positive thing that has happened recently is the Queensland government introduced the Land Restoration Fund, which was, still is, aimed to essentially build on the carbon market infrastructure that the federal government established. Whereas Queensland said, okay, well, that's great. It's helping us a bit, but there could be more done in terms of benefiting a bit more, given that Queensland is in an amazing position to benefit more. So they have actually invested in that. And it's one of these rare examples of federal and state governments actually working cooperatively, or at least not getting in the way of each other. In terms of getting them to do more, there are a range of different ways I guess you can do that, depending on your preference, holding your MPs to account, but as well as voting with your money. So it's holding governments to account, but also holding the private sector to account in terms of, well, the bank that I invest my money in is still investing in industries that I think are incompatible with climate change. So maybe I can move my money elsewhere.
Yeah, I think if you come up with a good answer to that second one that we can all apply,
Yeah,
we'll
I'm sorry. I know that's a really just a lazy response to that question,
No,
but honestly, I don't have a good answer either.
I think it's a question we all ask ourselves on a daily basis in some ways. How do I influence government to do whatever it is that I want them to do? Okay, thank you for the question and the answer. A next one from Mark Jones. The natural environment provides a number of services such as clean water, clean air, and a place to recreate. Why aren't dollar values placed on these services to show governments and the rest of society that the financial benefits of protecting the environment?
So I'll answer the question with a question. Who is putting the dollar value on those things? How? So who's responsible, right? One of the things that bothers me a little bit about particularly the valuing ecosystem services debate. We need to put a price on nature. We need to put a price on nature. Well, one way to do that is just to start investing in it, right? So again, using the example from the Land Restoration Fund when I worked there, the most frequent question we got was, well, how are you going to price that? What number are you putting on that? In terms of, when I say that, I mean we wanted to invest in projects that delivered carbon sequestration. We already knew the average price for a tonne of carbon, according to the federal scheme, was about $16 a tonne. We wanted to invest in carbon projects that not just delivered carbon sequestration, but other things, koala habitat, water quality, whatever. You could spend a lot of time and money investing in research, asking people how much would they pay to get this product, the contingent, or what do you call it, willingness to pay studies. They're all relatively hypothetical in terms of, and again, I'm bagging out economists a little bit, but there's a lot of studies of where people do surveys of how much would you pay for a koala, or how much would you pay for this? And they do some cool maths and then they come up with a number. So you could do some studies of that and then use one of those numbers to say, we're going to pay $20 for a koala. A, that would be, probably not great PR. But B, I think a slightly easier way is just to say, and go to the market and say, we want to invest in these kinds of projects. Here's the criteria. Here's the investment criteria. Here's the governance and the structure, how we're going to assess these projects. Put in your submissions and your proposals, the projects that you're going to do. Tell us how much, what price is going to make it economic for you to deliver the outcomes that you promise. And we'll assess whether that's good value according to our budget and our investment criteria. And that's what the Land Restoration Fund has done. I'd like to be able to tell you how much, per tonne approximately they are spending. That would be an interesting study, because then essentially by doing that market activity, a price is revealed through the market. It's not a non-market valuation, it's a market valuation. So I guess that's I think it's we tend to start things from a slightly the wrong angle, where we need to put in a price on nature. Well, if government does that, then private actors are going to generally not be super happy with that. So instead, why don't we just go to the market and say, well, here, we're going to invest in this. Tell us your price.
Thank you. Thanks for the question as well. Okay, Roger Burrett, sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Megan, as you say, the private sector will follow private interests, but these can be changed by government through responsive regulation policy. Do you see responsive regulation as the best framework to bring the social and private interests together, including the new facilitation role you see for the government?
Yes, responsive regulation is a great theoretical framework that has been, well, I think is in practice in terms of a lot of cases. For example, responsive regulation is in action every day in the Environment Department. in terms of, we go up, before we whack someone on the stick with a fine, we talk with them nicely and we ask them to please comply. And then we go up the pyramid and we say, well, if you don't comply, we'll send you a letter. And then later there might be threats of, fines, and then there might, ultimately we might take you to court. And the idea is that, well, the threat of going to court I want to avoid, so we'll resolve the issue by having a chat over coffee. So yes, is the answer to that question. I guess I would be interested in maybe what specifically about responsive regulation. Yeah, the answer is yes. I'm not a responsive regulation expert. It sounds like the questioner might be, so I would be very happy and keen to have a chat with them if later at some point if possible.
Can I on that then, Megan? We would ask at the end, but I'll just ask now because we're talking about it. What's the best way to reach out to you if people want to?
Oh, sure. So my email address is megan.evans@unsw.edu.au, so Third University. Or you can just Google Megan Evans, UNSW, and you should be able to find me.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, next question from Krista Singleton-Cambadge. Hi Megan, thanks. Have you got an average cost estimate for veg management to achieve carbon neutrality in the Australian red meat sector, particularly Queensland? Thanks. Oh, Stuart Blanche, so it must be asked on behalf of somebody.
No, not yet, Stuart. I'm working on it. Hang on, I need to see that question again. Average cost estimate to, okay, so no, I'm working on it. That's the project that I'm trying to work on. And indeed, okay, so some earlier work that I did on carbon farming in Queensland, which made some fairly heroic assumptions about economic rationality and the costs of doing things, and in terms of factoring in the opportunity cost of shifting from entirely beef business to a growing trees business. Now, that's a heroic assumption because we know that running cattle and growing trees isn't mutually exclusive. There's a lot of nuance that is lost when we do these big spatial analyses that I still do. But in those cases, depending on the part of Queensland and the profitability of a particular location for beef, and depending on the method of whether we're planting trees or just letting stuff grow back, it can vary between, I think this was a 2015 study, I think it varied between like $40 a tonne to $80 a tonne maybe, for assisted natural regeneration, so not planting trees directly, but again, that was completely saying we're stopping all grazing, so that would be an overestimate, I would think. Yeah.
If I can be so bold as to add a short follow-up question to that one, I wonder if there were any thoughts around the cultural change that would be required, because obviously cattle farmers aren't just there to make money, they're culturally cattle farmers, and the idea, I'm imagining, I don't know much about this, but the idea of switching over to being a veg manager or something probably isn't palatable to some.
Yes, putting it simply, yes, there are some social and cultural issues around veg management and grazing country that absolutely need to be taken into account, which is why I guess the blunt instrument of government regulation isn't usually particularly popular in these communities. At the same time, neither are markets necessarily. So, someone who has been running this kind of business for many years, and they might be several generations being on that property where the previous generations have all done similar things, understandably they're going to be a bit suspicious of someone turning up and saying, there's this great opportunity for you to totally change everything you do and every part of your identity. So yes, it's absolutely an area we need to be very careful and respectful about, and to work very closely with people and organisations to come up with solutions and options that are salient and make sense for those business people and community.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, I totally agree with everything for whatever it's worth. Our next question's from Carla Archibald. What types of businesses are more important in your mind? Is it about selectively targeting a few of the biggest businesses to adopt conservation financing practices with the hope it catches on? Or is it more about establishing institutional frameworks / markets to allow all businesses to engage in conservation finance?
Yep. I'm going to again do a classic fence sitting kind of response and say that I think there are lots of avenues. I guess the pathway and the approach that I or the angle that I'm most interested in personally is thinking about the more small and medium-sized enterprises that traditionally are. There's a World Bank report recently looking at how SMEs typically don't get access or the opportunity to access these kinds of capital flows and changes in investment opportunities because they don't have the power and capital and networks to make use and to I guess adapt and learn how to adapt to these new trends. I'm not particularly concerned about the big end of town. I think they'll be okay. At the same time, they do hold a lot of corporate and economic and political power. So yes, that there is a big role in working with that area. I guess for me personally, I'm a bit more interested in looking at the other perspective and thinking, well, that's all great. What does that mean for small and medium-sized enterprises? And what is the role of government potentially in stepping in and assisting that part of the market?
Thank you. I am aware that we're running a little bit over time, so if it's okay, we'll take one more question. Okay, thank you. Apologies to anybody else who has questions. As I said, you can contact Megan through her email. From Anthony Burke, there's two questions here. I'll give you one of them. Are there products and investments that you feel are not genuine contributions to biodiversity? And I guess the second one could fit into that nicely. Are the potentials for a clash between carbon and biodiversity goals?
Yeah, absolutely. So David Lindemeyer wrote a paper in 2013 with a number of esteemed people talking about the potential for what they call bioperversities. So, if we just focus on carbon, because carbon was the bandwagon that we all hitched on 10 years ago that we thought was going to save biodiversity. If we jump on the carbon train, what are the potential trade-offs and risks for biodiversity that we need to be careful about? So monocultures is a good example. If you're wanting to, I don't know, establish a green bond that invests in enterprises that sequester carbon but also increase forest cover. Well, what kind of forest cover? Because we just think about forest cover, we know that monocultures are great for forest cover, but they don't really house an awful lot of diversity. So, I guess that's the classic example of trade-off between carbon and biodiversity. And there's been a heap of work again in the last decade when we all got very excited about biodiversity and carbon in the conservation science space. Heaps of studies, global maps abound about, trade-offs and overlaps and synergies between carbon and biodiversity. Are there products and investments that I feel are not genuine contributions to biodiversity? I'm sure there are, but I couldn't give you a specific example off the top of my head. I mean, there's heaps, and a lot of it, again, comes back to disclosure and information. Like what does that really mean? When you're saying you're protecting habitat, what was going to happen to that habitat if you didn't protect it? Is that habitat that you're protecting as an offset? Does it also happen to be in a very remote and rocky and highly elevated location that means that habitat is unsuitable for a more productive use? That's a classic example from the biodiversity offset space, where we're protecting habitat, we're protecting heaps of habitat. Well, that habitat would have been there anyway if you didn't do anything about it. But now you're saying that you're protecting it in exchange for clearing habitat elsewhere. So we've actually had a net loss in biodiversity. So, many ways in which these things can go wrong.
Thank you. Yes, perverse outcomes is the name of the game when we're trying to do big systems change, I guess. So I'm going to thank you very much, and we won't get to our last few questions, unfortunately. Someone has just asked if there'll be a recording of the webinar available. Yes, I believe that Pete, who's our wonderful science comms person, is with us. Will be making that available.
Yes, that is recording right now, so
great.
All good.
Thanks so much. So yeah, thanks so much for coming along, Megan. It's been a real pleasure. I've certainly learned a lot. And I look forward to catching up and learning more next time I see you. So yeah, thanks for coming along to Finna.
Thanks so much. And I'll actually wander onto campus one day as well, maybe after the pandemic.
Yeah, it's a bit of a quiet place, but I'm sure you'll find someone to chat to. Yeah. Okay, thanks so much. And thanks for everyone who attended. It's fantastic to see all your names, if not your faces. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.